Snow carried a silence that was unlike any other season. It muffled sound, it softened light, and it turned every corner of the world into a pale stage where even the smallest movement felt exposed. On certain nights, especially in the depth of winter, that silence was not comforting. It was suffocating. People spoke of Christmas as a time of warmth, of music spilling from houses, of laughter echoing across frozen yards. But behind the glow of the holiday lights in the long hours past midnight when candles burned low and fires had died into embers, there lingered a truth that no one wanted to speak aloud. Some stories whispered through the generations insisted that the season was not always filled with joy. It was also a time when something ancient stirred, when doors creaked open on their own, when shadows seemed longer than they should have been. There is a story that still clings to the edges of memory,
one that surfaces like frost on glass whenever the winter winds return.
A house once stood on a quiet street, its windows glowing warmly against the snowstorm outside. Inside, a family gathered near the tree, gifts stacked neatly at its base, stockings hung along the mantel. Everything was set for a perfect Christmas morning. But that morning never came. By dawn, the house was dark, the tree toppled, and the front door stood open as if someone had left in haste. Neighbors would later describe the sight as if life itself had been drained from the place, leaving only an empty shell of festivity. What happened inside that house has been pieced together only through fragments. A phone call cut short by static, a child's toy found in the snow outside the door, a dinner table left mid-meal as though every person had risen at once. No footprints led away from the house and no trace of struggle could be found. Yet every person who had been inside that night was gone. Families do not vanish without a reason, but in this case there was no reason that could be grasped. Authorities searched, theories rose and collapsed, but the truth was never uncovered. The story spread like cold breath across glass. Some said the family had been victims of a crime too well concealed to uncover. Others whispered that the house itself was wrong, that something had been invited in under the guise of tradition. The Christmas tree, they said, had ornaments that were not bought but found, strange glass bulbs that reflected more than they should have, lights that flickered even when unplugged, a song that played faintly from a radio long after it had been switched off. These were the fragments, the whispers, the uneasy details that grew darker the longer they were repeated. And so the story became less about what could be proven and more about what could not, because the truth is this. Christmas has always carried a strange duality. On one side there is joy, community, and the promise of warmth against the cold. On the other side there is the fact that it occurs in the longest nights of the year, when shadows reign and silence holds dominion. Across cultures, winter was once feared as much as it was celebrated, for it was seen as a time when the veil between the living and the dead thinned, when unseen presences could move freely. Those ancient fears did not vanish simply because lights were strung and songs were sung. What lingers is the thought that those presences never truly left. They wait for the nights when families gather, when people open themselves to ritual and tradition, when doors are left unlocked for neighbors or for Santa, when a hearth is left burning but unwatched. In those small invitations, something else may slip through. It is said that spirits do not knock before entering. They do not need to. They wait for the moment when the world is distracted by celebration, and then they step inside. Perhaps that is why certain houses fall quiet long before they should. Why certain phone calls end with nothing but static. Why neighbors peer through frosted glass and see figures that should not be there, standing behind families who appear unaware. These are the kinds of stories that are dismissed until one notices that they repeat, not in the same town, not with the same family, but with details too similar to ignore. Gifts left unopened, candles snuffed out mid-prayer, a child's whisper carried across an empty room long after the child has gone. The question that no one dares to answer is whether these are coincidences or patterns. Whether the season of joy is also a season of sacrifice, one where something unseen takes what it is owed. And if that is true, then how many disappearances, how many tragedies buried in snow, have been quietly folded into the fabric of Christmas folklore? How many families are gone without explanation, remembered only as whispers of a holiday gone wrong? What chills is not simply the absence of answers, but the presence of silence. When investigators walk through a house that should have been alive with celebration and find it abandoned in perfect disarray, the quiet is louder than any explanation. It is the kind of quiet that does not comfort but unsettles, a quiet that feels as though it is waiting for someone to notice. Christmas lights blink in the dark. Snow falls without sound. Somewhere in the middle of it all, a door stands open. And the question lingers, the one no carol dares to ask. What truly waits in the silence of Christmas night? The story of that Christmas house does not exist in isolation. It has roots, and to trace them is to step carefully through time, through layers of snow and silence that stretch back farther than one might expect. The town itself was small, its streets narrow and lined with brick houses that looked nearly identical when covered by winter. It was the kind of place where people knew one another by name, where children grew up playing in the same fields their parents once had, where the sound of church bells still meant something. Yet even in such a close-knit place, there were histories whispered more than they were spoken, as though the act of saying them aloud risked awakening something best left sleeping. The house in question was not new. It had stood for nearly a century, its beams weathered by storms, its windows replaced more than once, its foundations strengthened after a fire long ago. Families had come and gone, each leaving behind fragments of themselves, photographs left in attics, initials carved into wood, stories told beside fires. But certain families never stayed long, as if the house itself discouraged permanence. Some moved within a few years, citing work opportunities elsewhere. Others left more abruptly, as though a quiet dread had crept into their lives until they could no longer ignore it. The property was never abandoned, never left unsold, but always seemed to be waiting for the next family willing to try their luck inside its walls. By the winter in which the tragedy unfolded, the house belonged to a family who seemed by all accounts ordinary. They decorated their front yard with colored lights. They attended midnight mass. They hosted dinners where neighbors gathered. They gave no reason for suspicion, no indication of turmoil. If anything, they were the kind of people others envied for their closeness, their ability to preserve warmth in a season that often felt endless. Their children were polite and well-liked. Their laughter carried across yards when snowball fights broke out. Their home, always glowing with warmth, seemed like a model of what Christmas was supposed to represent. And yet it was precisely that perfection that would make the darkness which followed all the more unsettling. The town had its own history with winter. Years earlier, before the family ever arrived, there had been another story, less well-remembered but still lingering in hushed recollections of older residents. On a Christmas Eve decades prior, a man had wandered into the woods outside of town and never returned. His tracks had been followed for miles until they ended abruptly in an open field. No sign of him beyond that final indentation in the snow. His body was never recovered, and in time his disappearance became folded into local lore, treated as one of those strange, unsolvable mysteries that winter seemed to favor. Some went further, claiming that Christmas itself carried a curse for the town, though such words were rarely spoken openly. It was not only the man in the woods. There had been other strange occurrences, fires that started without cause in homes decorated for the holiday, illnesses that struck suddenly and without warning, leaving families mourning in the very season meant for joy, candles that burned down to nothing in the span of a few minutes even when new, bells ringing when no hand pulled their ropes. These stories were scattered, isolated, but together they formed a shadow that stretched across decades. And yet, no matter how many oddities seemed to occur, families continued their traditions. They strung their lights, they sang their carols, they gathered around trees. Perhaps it was denial, perhaps it was resilience, but no one wanted to abandon Christmas. Instead, the shadows were treated as if they belonged to another layer of reality, one just thin enough to ignore until it broke through. Every community holds its contradictions, and in this town the contradiction was simple. Christmas was cherished and Christmas was feared. The family who entered the house that fateful season could not have known the weight of the place's history. They may have heard whispers, passing remarks about the house being unlucky, but such words are often dismissed as superstition. They did not see the house as a threat, only as a home, and yet their first December inside its walls would be their last. Friends would later recall small details, an offhand remark about strange drafts that seemed to move without wind, about ornaments that cracked even when untouched, about the sound of voices in the night mistaken at first for the radio left on. These remarks were not taken seriously at the time, because who listens to unease during the season of celebration? Who allows dread to spoil the illusion of joy? As the town would later learn, those small details were the only warnings they would ever receive. The family appeared happy and secure, preparing for their holiday as though nothing was wrong. But beneath the carols, beneath the laughter, there was a fracture forming. It is only in retrospect that such fractures are seen, and by then it is far too late. The historical weight of the town, the unease tied to winter, the whispers that stretched back generations, all of it converged in that single house in that single night. When the neighbors woke on Christmas morning and saw the door standing open, they could not have known they were looking at the continuation of a pattern that had been building for decades, a pattern that had roots deeper than memory, and so the context becomes clear. This was not just a family in a house on Christmas night. This was the return of something that had always been there, waiting quietly beneath the frost, patient enough to let traditions repeat until the moment came again. The question remains, if such patterns exist, then what force drives them? And why does it return again and again when the world is most vulnerable to warmth and joy? The final days before Christmas arrived with heavy snow that seemed endless, falling in thick sheets that buried cars, coated rooftops, and pressed against windows like a pale wall. Streets that had been busy with shoppers only days earlier became muted, their footsteps quickly erased by the storm. For the family in the house, the storm meant only one thing: time together. They decorated, baked, and wrapped gifts as if they were sealing themselves off from the outside world, turning their home into a cocoon of warmth against the blizzard. To neighbors, it seemed idyllic. Yet beneath the surface of ordinary cheer, there were details that began to unsettle those who looked closer. The first sign was subtle. One evening, as the snow piled higher, a neighbor swore they saw movement through the window. A tall figure stood in the corner of the family's living room, unmoving, watching the children play. At first, it was assumed to be the shadow of the tree, or perhaps a guest who had come to visit. But when the neighbor mentioned it later, days after the tragedy, they remembered that the figure had seemed too still, too dark, as though it absorbed light rather than reflected it. Inside the home, small disruptions began to surface. A set of ornaments, carefully placed on the tree, were found shattered on the floor without explanation. The family dog refused to enter the living room at night, standing at the doorway with its hackles raised, growling at something unseen. The children complained that their toys had been moved, though their parents dismissed it as imagination. They laughed at their own unease, but those small things never truly went away. The timeline leading up to the night would later be reconstructed only in fragments. A phone call placed by the father to a relative was cut short. The last words heard were that the storm seemed louder than usual, as if the wind had taken on a voice. The line crackled and then silence. Attempts to call back were met with nothing but static. Later that same evening, another neighbor reported seeing the front door open and close on its own, slamming hard against the frame despite the lack of wind strong enough to move it. They assumed someone was stepping outside to shake off snow or fetch firewood, yet when they looked closer, no one was there. On Christmas Eve, the family hosted a small dinner. Plates were laid out, food was served, and music played faintly from the radio. Guests later recalled that the night felt unusually heavy, as if the air itself pressed down on them. The lights flickered repeatedly, and once the radio cut out entirely, only to return with a faint warbled song that no one recognized. It was not a carol. It was slower, lower, and for a moment it seemed as though a second voice was layered beneath the melody. The guests dismissed it, laughed nervously, and continued eating. But several admitted afterward that they had felt watched, as though the house itself listened to their words. As the storm raged outside, the family went to bed unaware that it would be the last night they were seen. Sometime between midnight and dawn, something changed. The timeline becomes a blur here, pieced together only by evidence left behind. The dinner table was found later with food still on the plates, some half-eaten, some untouched. Chairs had been pushed back violently, as though everyone had stood at once. A single glass had shattered on the floor, but the pieces were neatly arranged in a small circle as if placed deliberately. The stockings that had hung by the fireplace were gone, not torn down, not scattered, gone entirely, hooks bare and untouched. Neighbors awoke early Christmas morning to the unusual silence. Normally the house was alive with the sounds of children running outside, playing in the snow, their laughter carrying across the yard. This time the yard was empty. The front door was wide open, letting snow drift inside. Lights that had glowed all season were dark. No voices carried. When one neighbor finally approached, calling out from the porch, there was no answer. Inside, the house felt wrong. The warmth that should have lingered from the fire was gone. The hearth was cold, though ash suggested it had burned only hours earlier. Upstairs, beds were found neatly made, covers undisturbed. Downstairs, the tree had fallen, its ornaments scattered, its light still faintly glowing even though the plug had been pulled from the socket. It was as though time had been severed in two, the moment before celebration and the moment after something had swept through. The strangest detail of all was found in the snow outside. A child's toy, one that had been unwrapped days earlier, lay half buried near the porch. Beside it, faint impressions in the snow suggested movement. But they were not footprints in the human sense. They were longer, almost stretched, as if something had dragged itself rather than walked, and then they stopped abruptly in the middle of the yard with no continuation in any direction. It was as if whatever had left them had simply vanished into the storm. This was where the mystery deepened. Families vanish, crimes occur, but the details here did not align with anything familiar. Authorities found no sign of forced entry, no fingerprints that did not belong, no evidence of struggle. The family's belongings remained intact. Gifts sat unopened under the tree, and yet every living soul in the house was gone. What unsettled the town was not simply the absence, but the way the absence felt alive. Rooms held a silence that pressed against the ears like standing underwater. Neighbors who entered to help search swore they felt watched, though no one else was there. One described the sensation of being followed from room to room, a weight just at the edge of sight. Another refused to go upstairs at all, saying that the staircase felt like it was breathing. In the days that followed, the house became a center of speculation. Children were warned not to go near it. Adults spoke in whispers about what could have happened. Some clung to rational explanations, an abduction, a planned disappearance. Others leaned toward something far darker, muttering that the house had always been waiting for its chance to take. And through it all, the snow kept falling, covering the yard, covering the strange impressions, covering everything as though nature itself wished to erase the truth before anyone could grasp it. In the weeks that followed, investigators combed through the house and its surroundings with meticulous care. Yet the deeper they looked, the more the evidence seemed to resist explanation. Every discovery raised more questions than it answered, each detail slipping into contradiction. What lingered most was not what they found, but what they did not. The kitchen offered the first puzzle. Plates were still set on the table, some with food untouched, others half-eaten as though dinner had been abandoned mid-bite. Yet no utensils lay scattered, no chairs overturned in panic. Instead, each chair was neatly pushed back as though every person had calmly stood at the same moment. The single broken glass lying on the floor should have been the exception. But the shards had not scattered randomly as one might expect. They were arranged almost carefully into a circle. Some swore this arrangement was impossible, unless someone had taken deliberate time to shape it. Others argued that the pattern was coincidence, fragments lying just so. But the longer one looked, the more deliberate it appeared. The fireplace was another detail that gnawed at investigators. Ashes lay in the hearth, proof that a fire had burned well into the night. Yet when examined closely, the wood was not burned evenly. Sections of logs appeared charred almost instantly, as if subjected to heat far greater than a normal flame could produce. The edges crumbled to fine powder at the touch, fragile as paper. It did not match the burn of a common house fire. Something else had licked at those logs, leaving them blackened beyond reason. Upstairs, the bedrooms appeared eerily undisturbed. Beds were made, pillows plumped, blankets drawn smooth. If panic had taken the family, it left no mark here. But one room carried a stain of unease. In the children's bedroom, the small toys arranged on shelves had been moved into odd positions. Dolls sat not facing the bed but turned toward the door, as if arranged in a silent audience. A rocking horse, normally kept against the wall, stood squarely in the center of the room. When one of the investigators touched it, it began to rock on its own. Slowly at first, then with a steady rhythm, creaking against the silence. No one admitted to setting it in motion. No one could say why it continued long after it should have stopped. The radio provided another clue. Found in the living room, it had been switched off, yet its speaker emitted faint static when touched. Technicians examined it and determined the wiring was faulty, the storm perhaps interfering with its signal. Yet locals remembered the strange melody it had played the night before. a song no one recognized, low and distorted, as if sung from another room. Recordings were attempted, but nothing unusual remained on the frequency. Whatever had been heard that night was gone, leaving only silence. The footprints outside proved the most debated evidence of all. At first glance, they seemed almost human, impressions pressed deep into the snow, spaced like steps. But the shapes stretched oddly, long and narrow, as though the weight that pressed them did not belong to a foot but something dragging itself forward. The prints continued for a short distance, then stopped in the open yard, vanishing entirely. No sign of turning back, no sign of lifting off, simply gone. The snow beyond remained untouched. Some argued the storm had buried the rest. Others swore the impressions ended too cleanly, as if erased by an invisible hand. Neighbors offered testimony that only added to the confusion. One swore they had seen lights flickering inside long after the power should have failed. Another claimed they heard voices coming from the house the morning after, low murmurs that grew silent the moment they stepped closer. A child in the neighborhood told their parents they had seen someone standing in the upstairs window after the family was already missing. A tall figure, too tall, watching the street below. The parents dismissed it as imagination, but the child's trembling voice lingered in their memory. The strangest account came from a man who lived across the street. He claimed that in the hours after midnight, during the height of the storm, he saw the family outside. All of them, parents, children, standing barefoot in the snow. They faced the woods beyond the yard, unmoving as though waiting for something. He admitted he watched only for a moment before drawing his curtains, convinced exhaustion had made him hallucinate. Yet his words were steady, his voice unshaken when he repeated the account days later. Others scoffed, but his insistence planted a seed of unease that never left. Investigators collected all of this: the broken glass, the scorched wood, the oddly placed toys, the unfinished meal, and filed it into reports. Yet when laid side by side, the details resisted logic. They did not form a picture of crime or accident. They formed a pattern that seemed designed to unsettle, as though the house itself had staged a performance to confuse anyone who dared to look. Psychologists suggested stress, claiming the family may have suffered some collective breakdown, driven by isolation, fear of the storm, or a hidden struggle no one else saw. But this theory faltered against the evidence. How does a family vanish without footprints? How do children calmly make their beds in the middle of terror? Others turn to folklore, speaking of winter spirits, of entities drawn to warmth and ritual, of old beliefs that certain nights invite visitations best left undisturbed. The evidence was there, catalogued, photographed, preserved, yet it did not explain. It only deepened the silence. And in that silence, people began to wonder whether the true purpose of the clues was not to reveal the truth, but to remind them of what they could never understand. The house remained, its walls unbroken, its rooms emptied of life, but every object left behind seemed to speak, not of what had happened, but of what still lingered. And those who entered found themselves asking the same question, over and over in whispers they did not want answered. What had truly stepped into the house that night, and why did it leave nothing but echoes? The house stood in silence, but the silence did not belong only to it. It spread. It seeped outward through the streets into kitchens, schools, and churches until the entire town carried it in their voices. In the days after the disappearance, children were kept indoors. Curtains were drawn earlier than usual. Conversations lowered into murmurs. The snow did not stop falling, yet it no longer seemed beautiful. It seemed heavy, like a shroud laid carefully over every rooftop, covering a truth no one could bear to face. The families nearby felt the change first. Neighbors who had once gathered on porches to sing carols or exchange gifts no longer lingered outside. They crossed streets quickly as though the very air near the house carried contagion. One woman admitted she could not bring herself to look at it. She said the windows reflected something that was not the sky. Another swore she woke in the middle of the night to hear the sound of children laughing in the yard, though she knew they were gone. When she stepped outside, the snow lay untouched, smooth as glass. The church became a place of both solace and fear. Services were crowded, voices louder, hymns sung with desperate conviction, yet even there the absence was felt. Parishioners would glance toward the empty pew where the family once sat, their eyes flicking quickly away as though staring too long might invite something to follow them home. Candles lit in remembrance seemed to sputter more quickly than others, their wax melting faster, dripping in long streams across the altar. Priests spoke of faith, of mysteries beyond human comprehension, but their words were thin against the weight pressing on every heart. Children absorbed the silence in their own ways. Some refused to sleep in their bedrooms, insisting on curling up beside their parents, eyes wide and unblinking long into the night. Others whispered stories at school, saying the missing family had not been taken but had joined something in the woods, something waiting for the next to follow. Teachers tried to quiet them, but whispers have a way of growing. Soon even the youngest knew fragments of the tale, their drawings filled with crooked houses and dark figures standing in doorways. The psychological toll deepened with time. Parents became suspicious, watching windows, checking locks twice, 3 times before bed. One man was seen walking the perimeter of his home with a lantern well past midnight, circling again and again, as though guarding against something unseen. Another woman stopped decorating her house entirely, leaving it dark while others still clung to lights. When asked, she said it felt wrong to invite attention. It felt like calling something closer. Grief settled most heavily on relatives of the family. Their voices broke when they spoke of the last phone call, the unfinished conversation cut short by static. They replayed it in their minds endlessly, wondering if the father's final words had been a warning rather than a passing remark. They imagined him standing in the dark, hearing something they could not, reaching for help before silence swallowed him. The uncertainty was a wound that did not close. Without bodies, there were no funerals. Without funerals, there was no closure. It was as if grief had been suspended in ice, sharp and unmelting, always present, never softened by ritual or time. The psychological impact extended beyond mourning. There was paranoia. People began to see patterns in ordinary things. Lights flickering in kitchens were no longer shrugged off as faulty wires. They were signs. Dogs barking at night were not warnings of raccoons, but of something moving through the dark. Even the storm itself became suspect. When the wind howled against shutters, it sounded to many like voices pressed close to the glass, whispering in a tongue just out of reach. And as fear grew, so did guilt. Neighbors replayed the days before the disappearance, questioning their own blindness. Should they have noticed the strange figure in the window? Should they have taken the father's unfinished phone call as more than static? Should someone have knocked on the door when the lights flickered oddly, or the front door slammed on its own? These thoughts grew heavier with every passing night, until some confessed to dreaming of the family, not as they were, but as they might be now, faces pale, eyes black, standing just beyond the snowdrifts, waiting to be seen. The community fractured. Some clung harder to tradition, decorating their houses even brighter as though drowning the darkness in light. Others retreated entirely, refusing to celebrate at all. Friendships strained under the weight of disagreement. Faith battled with fear. Rumors spread that those who spoke too often of the house found themselves plagued with nightmares, that the very act of repeating the story gave it strength. And so silence became both shield and curse. The house itself stood unchanged, yet it grew more terrifying with every day it remained. No one moved to claim it. No one dared step inside after the initial search ended. Its windows darkened, its yard filled with snow, its Christmas lights still hanging like bones of a memory. But people swore it was not empty. They said shadows moved behind the curtains, that the faintest glow sometimes flickered in the rooms long after the electricity had been cut. Others claimed the house sighed at night, wood creaking not from cold but from something shifting inside. Over time, the psychological wound deepened into legend. The disappearance was no longer just an event. It was a mirror held to every person in town. It showed them fragility. It showed them how quickly warmth could be erased, how easily joy could be swallowed by silence. And it left them with the most unbearable truth of all, that something could take not only lives, but the meaning of those lives, leaving nothing behind but absence. Even years later, when snow falls and the air grows heavy, people glance toward that house. They feel it pressing at the edge of thought like a weight behind the eyes. They do not speak of it often, but they feel it still. The dread, the guilt, the unanswered questions. And in the quiet moments, when the wind settles and the world seems too still, they hear it again. The laughter of children in the yard, faint and distant, carried through the snow. When investigators closed their files, the town was left with absence dressed as silence. But silence does not hold forever, it cracks. And through those cracks, speculation seeped in like winter wind. If official answers could not be found, then others would fill the void, each more unsettling than the last. Over time, the tragedy became less a question of what happened and more a debate of which horror seemed most believable. Authorities clung to one explanation: human interference. Perhaps the family had been abducted. Perhaps a group entered unseen, forced them from their home and left no trace. It was tidy on paper, a theory that required no shadows, no superstition. Yet it unraveled quickly. There were no tracks leading away. The storm had fallen heavy, yes, but not heavy enough to erase every path so neatly. And even if tracks were lost to snow, how could entire families vanish without leaving evidence of resistance? No broken locks, no torn fabric, no cries heard through the night. It was abduction without force, and that alone made it ring hollow. A second explanation emerged among psychologists brought in to study the case. They suggested a shared delusion, a phenomenon known to occur under stress. The storm, the isolation, the pressure of holidays, all could have cracked the family's collective sense of reality. Perhaps they walked willingly into the snow, believing they were answering some unseen call. It was possible, but when asked how children could maintain such calm, how beds could remain neatly made, how a circle of glass shards could arrange itself with precision, the experts faltered. Shared delusion may explain a step into the cold, but it does not explain order woven into chaos. Beyond these official channels, darker theories thrived. Some whispered of ritual. Old stories spoke of midwinter sacrifices, offerings made in the longest nights to ensure survival through the cold. Could it be that the family stumbled unknowingly into something ancient, something that demanded repetition? The circle of glass, the vanishing stockings, the figures seen in windows, all became symbols in this retelling, pieces of a rite too old to name. But if sacrifice was made, to whom and for what? And why now, after decades of silence? Others leaned toward the supernatural, their voices hushed but insistent. They spoke of the house not as a building, but as a vessel, a place that remembered. Each family that passed through left behind more than belongings. They left whispers, echoes, fragments of fear. Over time, the vessel filled, until one winter it could no longer contain what had been gathered. What if the family had not been taken by something outside, but by something born inside, something woven into the walls? Some swore the rocking horse in the children's room, the dolls turned to face the door, were signs not of play but of mimicry, as if the house itself had learned to imitate life and then consumed it whole. There were those who reached further still. They connected the disappearance to older disappearances, to the man whose tracks ended in the field, to fires that burned without cause, to bells that rang without hands. To them, this was not one tragedy but a pattern repeating across generations. They believed the town itself carried a shadow, a presence bound to its soil, awakened each time joy grew too bright. Christmas, they argued, was not protection but invitation. Lights, songs, prayers, all were signals, all called attention, and something somewhere always answered. Folklorists were drawn to the case in later years, eager to compare it to tales from other regions. They found similarities in Scandinavian stories of spirits that visited homes in winter, punishing those who failed in ritual. They drew parallels to Alpine legends of dark figures who followed behind St. Nicholas, not to give but to take. Even in distant cultures, they found echoes, beings who watched from the shadows of celebration, who waited for doors left open, who claimed those careless enough to forget that joy and fear often walk side by side. But folklore cannot be catalogued like evidence. It grows, it shifts, it bends toward belief. And so, while scholars traced parallels, the townspeople felt only dread. To them, these comparisons did not explain. They confirmed. They confirmed that what happened was not unique, that it was part of something larger, something that stretched beyond their borders and back into history itself. Amid all these theories, one detail lingered most heavily. The man across the street who swore he saw the family outside in the snow, barefoot facing the woods. His testimony did not fit neatly with abduction, delusion, or folklore. It was too specific, too ordinary in its strangeness. He said their faces were blank, their bodies unmoving, their eyes fixed on something far beyond sight. He swore that when he looked too long, his ears filled with a sound that was not wind but humming, low and steady, coming from the trees. He shut his curtains and never looked again. For years he carried that silence, refusing to expand further as though words might summon it back. Investigators wrote reports, psychologists gave interviews, Folklorists published essays, but no explanation held. Each theory carried its own fractures. Each attempt to rationalize collapsed under the weight of detail. And so the town was left with fragments. Footprints that ended too soon, glass arranged too neatly, laughter heard when no one was left to laugh. What became clear was not which theory was true, but that none could provide comfort. Each path, whether rooted in crime, madness, ritual, or legend, led to the same place. An open door, a vanished family, a silence that could not be broken. And perhaps that was the cruelest answer of all. Not that the truth was beyond reach, but that the truth was not meant to be known. Theories remain, spoken in whispers, written in notes, carried like frost through memory. But every theory ends the same way, with the image of a family standing in the snow, waiting for something unseen, with the question of what finally stepped forward to meet them. Time does not heal all wounds. Some are not meant to close. The house where the family vanished still stands, though it is older now. Its paint faded, its roof patched against the weather. Yet no one lives there. No laughter rises through its walls, no fires burn in its hearth. It is maintained only enough to prevent collapse, as though the town itself cannot decide whether to preserve it as a warning or erase it entirely. People walk past quickly, their eyes fixed ahead, refusing to look at the windows. And still, in the corner of their vision, they sense it, an impression of movement, a shadow withdrawing just as they pass. The disappearance became more than an event. It became a weight that pressed down on generations. Children who were not yet born when it happened grow up knowing the story, hearing it whispered at night like a tale told to frighten them into obedience. They walk by the house and feel the pull of silence, heavy and watching. They know it without knowing why, as though the dread itself has seeped into the soil, inherited alongside the land. To live in the town is to inherit that silence. To leave is to carry it with you, like frost clinging to breath long after you step indoors. What unsettles most is not the tragedy itself, but its persistence. Every year, when snow falls thick and lights appear in windows, when families gather and laughter fills the air, the memory stirs. People recall the empty table, the open door, the toy abandoned in the snow. They recall the footprints that ended without reason, the circle of glass, the stockings gone without trace. And they wonder if joy itself is the trigger, if the brightness of the season attracts something darker. If every Christmas carries with it the risk of attention from something that does not belong. There are always whispers in winter. A neighbor who swears they heard children's laughter near the empty house, a passerby who insists a light flickered in the upstairs window, a traveler who wakes in their car to see a figure watching from the yard, tall and unmoving. None of these accounts are verified, but none are dismissed outright. They hang in the air, retold again and again as if the silence of the house demands to be filled with stories. And in time, those stories blur into memory until it is impossible to say what was fact and what was fear. It is easy to call it superstition, to laugh at the idea of spirits moving through houses, of rituals repeated through centuries, of families swallowed whole by unseen hands. Yet there remains one question no one has answered. Where did they go? Not in theory, not in folklore, but in reality. Their clothes remained. Their gifts remained. Their lives remained half-lived, frozen in place. And yet the people themselves were gone. No bodies, no blood, no trace. Only absence. Only silence. The silence is the loudest clue of all. It lingers in the rooms, pressing against the ears of anyone who dares enter. It seeps into photographs, into testimony, into the air itself. People leave the house shaken, unable to describe what unsettled them most. It is not what they saw, but what they felt. That they were not alone, that something waited in the corners, watching, patient, unwilling to reveal itself. It is the silence of being observed by something that does not breathe. Over the years, some have suggested demolishing the house, erasing it entirely. But each time the idea arises, resistance follows. Some argue that to destroy it would be to invite whatever lingers there into the open. Others say the house is a reminder, a warning that must remain visible. And so it stands, caught between ruin and preservation, a monument not to memory but to mystery. And still, each Christmas the same question returns. Whispered in living rooms, muttered by neighbors, asked quietly by those who cannot sleep. If it happened once, could it happen again? If joy calls to the dark, then how many doors stand open each winter, waiting unknowingly? How many families laugh in living rooms, unaware of the silence gathering at their thresholds? The truth may never be uncovered. Perhaps it was never meant to be. Perhaps the real horror lies not in finding answers but in living with the absence of them. Because absence is not empty, it is full. Full of questions, full of dread, full of the sense that something unseen has moved just beyond your sight. And so, as snow falls again and lights flicker in windows, as families gather around their trees and laughter echoes into the night, one thought presses cold against the heart. What waits in the silence when the carols fade? When the fire dies, when the door is left unlocked, and when it comes again, who will be the next to vanish into the snow?